Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby here with Paul Lambert on his latest Oscar nomination, visual effects supervisor for Dune. And congratulations, first of all, on this your latest nomination. And I would say probably the most iconic digital image from the film that we should dive into first is the sandworm. Of course, it is massive. What is it like trying to render something on this type of scale? Is it difficult to get that right?
Oh yeah, for sure. And thank you for having me here, Sam. Yeah, so the worm was a challenge, but it wasn't just the worm. It was the worm and the sand. Like from a visual effects perspective, like trying to move that amount of sand realistically is a very time-consuming process in the visual effects. And when I joined the project, I was on the project for just under 2.5 years, and when I joined the project, which was like 6 months before we actually started shooting, I actually got the facility DNEG to actually start doing tests early on to be able to come up with a way in which to displace that amount of sand. And like one thing with a visual effect is that to make a believable visual effect, it's always best when you try and base it on something in reality, something in nature. And it's pretty much impossible to find anything where you can displace that much sand. Now, I did ask the production during the shoot if like we could do some explosive testing on the Dune so that I could get some reference, but then like I was reminded that we were in the Middle East, and that was probably not the best thing to be doing in that particular area. So yeah, so we started to do tests very early on, and like it was a good year of development before like we got to a place where like we could safely render that in a way which is quick enough to work with the edit. And like the actual worm itself went through a process where like Denis and Patrice had basically concepted the entire movie. They had been working together for about 8 months prior to when I joined, and like there were these beautiful images for like the worm, for Arrakeen, for the ornithopters. So and usually concept artwork is usually a springboard for for more evolved ideas. But Denis was so happy with these that like basically we stuck with these religiously, and we had the design for the worm, but then obviously we had to try and make it move. And it went through a process of like trying to find reference to help influence how this creature would move. And like we went through and found references of earthworms, of snakes, like trying to get this like huge creature to move in this way. And what we found was that it was very clinical and biological in the movement, and it wasn't very cinematic at all. So, and at the same time, the like sand tests were going on as well based on these movements. And what we found was that over time, that the sand actually behaved a little bit like water. Like you would get all of these ripples as like a dune grew in size or it collapsed, and it started to feel like water. And that kind of influenced that potentially this sandworm was in fact a sand whale. So that's how the language kind of developed, in that like you actually treated the dunes as waves, and like sometimes the worm would crest these dunes or like explode through. So like it became very much a correlation to water rather than to sand.
Yeah, that's interesting. The mouth of it kind of, when he faces off with Paul, kind of looks like a whale mouth that it would go and get killed from.
And like all of those, all of those long kind of teeth are actually bailing. Is actually based on the bailing of a whale, and like how a whale will travel through the sea and like sift through and catch krill. The idea is that the worm sifts through the sand, and it gets all of the nutrients which then are created into spice. So there is very much a worm, a whale in water influence on the worm and sand.
Yeah. And the sand too, speaking of, has to like, it covers this entire planet, which kind of dictates a certain color palette for the film. Like everything is kind of washed in this brown color. Does that make things difficult when you have to like animate it to be very violent, like in a sandstorm, when you have this one specific color washed over everything?
Yeah. So actually on the set, our special effects supervisor, Gert Nebser, actually used 18 tons of actual sand, where like basically he would be constantly blowing this. Well, it wasn't actually sand; it was dust, because like you can't really blow around sand like that safely. But like it was this dust, and like he used 18 tons of it. And every day, every single day, like we had all of these wind machines blowing the sand everywhere, because basically we had built practical ornithopters which didn't have wings, but like we were going to add wings in post, but like we still needed all of the interaction, people's clothes flapping, and so every time we were on Arakeen or in the spaceport, basically we had this constant blowing of sand, and that created this kind of wash of color over everything. And Denis wanted a white sky for the desert, because there are times out in Wadi Rum where like early morning, that like you would get this white sky, and almost, I don't want to say foggy, but like something where like you don't see as far as you should. And that it was a very particular look. And yes, it's a desaturated look, and that's basically what Denis wanted for this planet, which was like a hostile environment. It was never going to be a colorful, beautiful world. No, this was a hostile environment, just like how we designed the city of Arakeen. It's all based on like these almost brutalist kind of buildings, which are like protection from the environment. So on those shots where you see we fly over Arakeen, you never see any people outside, because they're all hidden away, because nobody wants to be in that particular environment. So it was very much a conscious decision to like try to make this place not very pretty, harsh, and with this hot arid sun always beating down on everybody.
You saying that you were adding the wings of the ornithopters in post reminds me, there's this kind of cliche line that we hear all the time about, oh, we'll fix it in post. Like the visual effects team will just do this in post, in terms of if it's a building that's not there, if it's something that needs to be added. I imagine that was not the case on this movie. Is that correct? It seems like very planned out.
Yeah, exactly. We actually spent when I joined the production, we spent 6 months in pre-production actually talking about all the different techniques, all the different ideas that we could use to make the visual effects successful. And like you're totally right. Like we never had that attitude of like we would shoot something in a certain way and we'll fix it in post, because like we can fix it in post, but if you like you're on set with like these amazing people with this amazing talent and amazing experience, so like you want to get the best out of everybody, so that when you then go into post-production, you then have the best that you could have possibly caught, which then makes for a far more a far better visual effect, because like you've got a great place to actually start with. Whereas if you shoot something and you're not quite happy with it, but then like you go into it, oh, we'll fix it in post. Yes, you can do a good job, but it will never be as good as if like you were truly happy with like what you actually shot.
Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest, I think, effects scenes is the sort of bombing and assault on the Arakeen Palace. How much of that sort of has to be practical effects versus how much digital trickery is in there to expand it?
It's all about the light. Like we're in a place in visual effects that you can give me any piece of footage and I can put any background behind you. But if the lighting intent on the foreground doesn't match the lighting on the background, there isn't much I can do. Yes, I can push and pull the image and stuff, but it's always going to look like a composite, and just to the average person watching a movie, like the if the two don't match, then like you then get a sense of disbelief because like something isn't quite right, but you don't know what it is, and like it just takes you out. It just takes you out of the movie. And like we tried really hard so that like we came up with all the different techniques where like that wouldn't happen. And in that particular scene, like Gert again had like fireballs on set which would light up our characters, and basically we timed those to the digital explosions which like we then added. We did shoot some real explosions on set, but they were mainly for reference for us to be able to copy, and then after that in post we were then able to copy those explosions and then replace all of the fireballs where like basically you see Josh running and then suddenly there's a great big explosion and like you see all that beautiful light on his face. Well, that's practical. And then after that, we just added in the explosion for instead of the fireball. So then like the two worlds then sits, and that's actually a very effective sequence. It's one of my favorites in that just because it does feel real, and like you get taken by the whole story of it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of light, one of my favorite, this movie is very grand in scale, but one of my favorite, I think, effects was a more intimate moment with the hunter-seeker scene where Paul has to hide and stay still in this sort of hologram where there's all this. How did you deal with those like individual bands of light on his skin?
So that again was a technique in which we came up with, and like I don't want to say easiest because it's actually really quite difficult to do, but like I've done digital humans before close up, and I know how incredibly difficult that is to make look real, and it's a time-consuming process, and it's a very costly process. So I wanted to investigate. Okay, is there a way in which we can try and do some of this practically? And what we came up with was a very much a mixture between old school practical effect and a very high tech digital effect. So what we actually came up with is we designed the holographic bush, and we got a sign off from a Denis. We then sliced that bush into hundreds of little cross-sectional slices of the bush. We then came up with a technique on set where like we could interactively work out where Paul was on set. So basically we had all these cameras around Paul, and we were able to do something which we call tracking. So we could figure out where Paul was at any particular point in the scene. What we then did is, based on that tracking information, we would then project with an old school projector a cross-sectional slice of the bush onto Paul. So basically he was in a particular position. He would then have that projected onto him. When he moved, the tracking got updated, and then another slice would be projected. And then like when he moved, then like another one. And what that gave you was the impression of him actually moving through the hologram bush, because like each cross-section would be projected onto him. Now, it did mean that you got a whole bunch of light on the wall behind him, but then like the actual gold in it was that you actually got real subsurface interaction on his skin, and that's what's really time consuming to get to be photoreal in the computer graphics. So like we had the perfect interactive pass, but also because Greg, our DP, could see it, and Timothy could also sense where like the actual light was, it allowed for framing interactively with them. Whereas if you'd been in the virtual world, like it's all done in post. So like having Greg's ability to frame something based on that interactive light again was super valuable. So then we took that interactive pass, took it into post, and then put the CG bush in front of Paul, put the CG bush behind Paul, cleaned up the wall, and then you had something which felt a little bit more believable than like, yeah, look, you could have got there with a CG Paul, but it would have taken way longer to actually get there. That's for sure.
Yeah. You know, you've talked a lot about sort of finding real world references to make things, you know, believable to the eye with visual effects. So when you think about a big sci-fi, I mean, science fiction is all dealing with things that don't really exist in our world. When you compare that to like effects you'd have to do for First Man, for instance, where there are real, you know, ships that fly into space that we have. Is one of those more difficult? Is it more difficult to sort of be in a playground like Dune that doesn't have
It's
readily available references?
it's similar in that, like, yes, like we are creating these other world, you know, these other worlds and these flying ships, but you know, in trying to keep things photoreal and grounded, it's like the camera work is very key to this kind of trying to keep the audience believing what they're seeing. And in that, like, we have plenty of all CG shots in Dune, but then what you see is that the there aren't any cameras which you physically couldn't do. Like there aren't any virtual cameras. Like you don't go crashing through, you know, like crashing down into the worm over the sand, because like it's so high, because it would be near enough impossible to actually try and get an actual camera to actually do that. And that's very much the approach. Like, you know, you have wides, you have like subtle camera work. So the idea being that like you want to keep the audience still believing that like this could actually happen. And you know, it's not to say that like the you know, like having these other virtual amazing cameras which go, you know, it's just a different style. And you know, it's very much in Denis' way of working is to try and keep everything as photoreal and as grounded as possible, because like he never ever wants a visual effect shot to take away from the story. Like, you know, even something as subtle as you know, from a visual effects standpoint, you know, the blue eyes, like it's so easy to have them so strong that like each time you cut to somebody with blue eyes, it takes you out of the story and you're just watching the eyes rather than listening to what they're actually saying. So it's a very delicate balance to like try and keep the narrative which like he's trying to portray.
Mm. Well, before I let you go, I wanted to ask, because this film, you know, is really seems like it's designed for a big giant cinema experience. Does that change your work and your approach when you're thinking about something, or you always approach movie making like that?
Well, it's important that you see the work. Yeah. So it's important that you see the work on a big screen and a small screen, because like you do have a different experience, and like you do pick up errors as well, you know, like technical errors on a small screen, which sometimes you don't see on a big screen because like you don't always see it. And then also you see things on the big screen which you miss on the small screen. So like I am forever, you know, doing reviews on a smaller screen, but then it's imperative that like I take those reviews to a much bigger screen to actually experience it, because it is a different feeling, because you know, having a bigger screen immerses you more into the world. And like sometimes there's so much to watch that, you know, you may be looking at one point that like you don't see it on another, whereas on a smaller screen it is very different. So I tend to work hand in hand. You know, I can't do it just on a small screen or just on a big screen. It's got to be both. It just has to be.
Well, it was fantastic work here creating the world of Dune. So thank you so much for talking about it with me. If you're out there watching, make sure you keep up to date with us at Gold Derby. There's plenty more interviews like this with other nominees. And best of luck, Paul. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, sir.